The world's foremost designer in Formula One, Adrian Newey, is arguably one of Britain's greatest engineers. In an unrivaled career in motorsport spanning nearly 40 years, he's designed for the likes of Mario Andretti, Nigel Mansell, Alain Prost, Damon Hill and Sebastian Vettel, securing 10 Constructors' Championships and 150 race wins in the process. And whilst his career has been marked by unbelievable triumph, there's also been deep tragedy, most notably Ayrton Senna's death during his time at Williams in 1994. His eventual career in Formula One has now been encapsulated in a fascinating and powerful memoir called How to Build a Car. And he joins me now to reflect on his astonishing life in motorsport. It seems appropriate to start at your childhood. What sort of childhood was it? How do you reflect on it? Was it a happy time? Do you feel like you were always destined to end up in Formula One?
It's what I always wanted to do from probably the age of 10, yes. My father was a vet, no obvious connection, but he was also a great car enthusiast, so he had Mini Cooper S's and Lotus Elans and that sort of thing. And he had a little workshop in the garden where he used to sort of make bits to go on the cars. He was always modifying and tinkering with them. And I guess that kind of rubbed off on me, so when the first Lotus Elan arrived, it used to come on the back of a trailer. And it was billed as you could build it in a weekend from this kit into a car. I think it took my dad with me probably hindering more than helping about 2 months, not one weekend. But it was great because that sort of showed you how a car went together. I used to build these Tamiya 12 scale model kits, which were also good because they had working suspension and all the parts were labelled and all that sort of thing. So it was a very young passion for cars from my parents, and then for whatever reason, I think perhaps the first scale electric kit I had when I was 6 or something. Then also from my side a passion for motor racing, and so design engineering, wanting to be a racing car designer, just seemed completely natural to me.
I mean, it's so wonderful to be able to follow your passion and turn that into a career. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that would love to have the same, you know, just to know that they've kind of, that's their destiny. But when did you feel that you could actually make a career out of it?
Unwittingly, I was practicing the 500-hour rule, you know, this thing that to get good at something, you should practice it for at least 500 hours. And I was doing that in some ways from about the age of 12, because I then started cannibalising these models I'd made, sketching out my own designs, using my dad's workshop to fold up bits of aluminium and make bits of fiberglass and so forth, and take my sketched out designs on bits of A4 paper and make them into little models. So I didn't know what I was doing, of course, but I was still practicing turning something from here to paper to a physical piece. When I was about 14, I was desperate to go karting, and so I managed to talk my dad into taking me to the local kart track, Shennington, near Banbury. And he made the very accurate observation that as far as he could see, most of the kids that were there because their dads wanted them to be rather than because they really wanted it themselves. So he offered that for every £1 I could earn, he would put in £1, which was great, but of course, you know, newspaper rounds, wash the car, whatever, double the money, it's still not very much. So I bought this really tired old Barlotti kart with a Villiers engine in it. And the combination of it and me, when we had turned up for practice at Shennington, were hopelessly slow. So the passion really actually became modifying the kart and trying to make it go faster more than the driving. So I learnt to weld, and I did bits and pieces and rebuilt the engine and so on and so forth. And that reinforced the passion.
What I don't think many people realise is that you actually had great success out in America before Formula One, back in the 80s, 85, 86. Tell us about that time.
I was lucky enough to get my first job in motor racing as an aerodynamicist, which is always the difficult one. You know, how do you get that first job? I was lucky to get in. So I worked for Fittipaldis for a year and a half, and then moved to March, which was a production engineering team that used to make cars for Formula 2, Formula 3, etc. And they also had a sports car, a Group C car, lying around. I did my final year project on ground effect aerodynamics applied to sports cars. So I approached Robin Hurd, the boss of March, and said, look, what's happening to that sports car over there? And he said, well, nothing really. And I said, well, I think I could I've looked at this and I think I could improve it. And he said, well, okay, if that's what you think, have a go. But there's no budget for wind tunnel testing or anything like that. You'll have to do it on your own. So I did. I worked away and redid the aerodynamics by eye, which is a very dangerous thing to do, but got away with it. Got some weight out of it, modified it and so forth. And then we actually took the car up to Donington for a test in very early January with Tiffany Dell. Did half a day around Donington with the car. And then Robin managed to sell it to a guy in America who had a Ferrari Testarossa road car, like the old, I think, PI Magnum type car, and fancied himself as a bit of a racing driver. So he bought the car and entered it for the Daytona 24 hours, as you do. We turned up with a couple of English mechanics, and we were up for 2 days before the race, practicing qualifying, up all night because the car wasn't ready to race. It's hopelessly unreliable, and we kind of qualified mid-grid. Got to the start of the race thinking it'll break down after a couple of hours. We can all go home. I remember going to the loo in the middle of the night, and Daytona's like Indy, where you have a sort of tall tower and the P1, and then it'll have the car number and so forth. And we'd lost track of where we were. I just tried to keep the car running because I was also promoted myself to team manager, and looked up as I walked into the loo and it said P1 car 66. I thought, standing there, 66, I know that. That's us. And we actually led the Daytona for about 12 hours and ended up finishing second. And that kind of launched my American career, really, because off the back of that, Robin sold some more sports cars. And then because they went well and won the championship, he promoted me to be in charge of the IndyCar project and went on to do IndyCars, and kind of that got my career going, really. The move to Williams was actually kind of born at least partly out of the fact that I got the sack from Lacing House. So I didn't have much, I had to go somewhere. Luckily, Patrick, I think, was quite impressed with our first year at Lacing House, and we got to know each other. So he offered me a job as in charge of the research department, R&D department at Williams. And so I accepted it, and just, I was thinking about it when as I say, I got the sack anyway, so I didn't have much choice but to accept. Those days at Williams, I look back with great fondness. Patrick was very good to me. He gave me a lot of design freedom. And I think the two of us worked very well together to start with, because I was able to concentrate on the aerodynamics and mechanical design and packaging, which is the bit I really enjoy. Patrick always had a penchant for gearboxes, so he designed the gearbox, and more importantly, kind of ran all the engineering side of the company. So it was a good marriage, and we had some good level of success.
Good division of labour. And actually, Frank described you as the most competitive person he knows, which is some statement, given how long he's worked in Formula One. How do you take that? I mean, I would think it's a compliment, actually.
Well, it's interesting. It's funny you say that, because I remember very clearly when he said that to me, and I was actually quite insulted at the time. I thought, okay. And I've kind of reflected on it over the months and years, and it is, you're right, it is a compliment, and he meant it as a compliment, because how can I put it? I don't like being beaten, and I hate to admit it, I can be a bit of a sore loser.
Of course, that time at Williams, as great as it was up until '94, you had the terrible tragedy of Ayrton Senna, which affected you deeply, didn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm sure it still does. How did you deal with it at the time, and how do you reflect on that time now?
It's funny, isn't it? It still seems quite raw and immediate when I talk about it. It was an extremely difficult time. Silly when you look back, because I'd never ever thought about the question, if somebody's hurt or worse still passes away in a car that I've been responsible for, how would I feel? Never thought about it. And then, of course, suddenly this happens. That whole Imola weekend was a horrible weekend. And I suppose the immediate thing was the sense of waste more than anything. Ayrton was a great man. People talk about somebody having an aura about them, And it's very difficult to quantify why you would feel that way about somebody else. Is it because of what they've achieved or the personality that they radiate? What is it? But for whatever it was, Ayrton had that aura that when you were with him and talking to him, his kind of enthusiasm and inquisitiveness and energy was infusive. And the little time I spent with Ayrton was very memorable. I still think if that hadn't happened that day, perhaps he'd be president of Brazil now or something. I don't know. But he was. So, to get back to your direct question, it was a sense of waste that I felt more than anything. And then, of course, we had to go through the thing of what happened. The immediate thought after the race was that the steering column failed, and that was the obvious conclusion. We've all seen the pictures where the steering wheel with the end of the column was lying next to the car. Once we got the onboard video recording back from Michael's car following, then that started to change, because it became apparent from that video that the car oversteered first, so the rear stepped out and then it swung round and then it went straight, which certainly implied at the very least that the first incident was the car losing the rear, which is clearly not consistent with a steering column failure. And then we started to get the data back. The data recorders on the car were damaged, but we can get some data back from them. It showed that we couldn't replicate what the data showed if the column had failed prior to it hitting the wall. So from an engineering point of view, it's very difficult to see how the steering column failure could have caused the accident. The implication is that the column, which is a very poor piece of design and definitely had a crack in it, but the eventual failure was on impact. So exactly what caused the accident, I don't think we will ever know. It was, as I say, the biggest memory I have of it is actually the klaxons. That standing on that pit wall, none of us knew what was happening, and the Italians had all these air horns and they were going mad with them. It was just this constant noise of klaxons and chaos, and then we were told he was okay, then he wasn't. Yeah, no, it was horrible. And I'd say, people talk about safety in Formula One, and there's all this current debate about should the halo be in or shouldn't it. But when you see something like that and the waste and the tragedy that goes with it, I think we should always be trying to make the sport as safe as possible.
And of course, manslaughter charges hung over you for a number of years. Did you feel like you had the support of the team that you needed?
It was totally unnecessary, in as much as Ayrton's family didn't want any further court proceedings. They just wanted to grieve in private and not have a big world show about it. But unfortunately, the prosecution magistrate who was appointed to look at the case, I think, if I'm honest, it feels like he sure saw the chance for international fame and glory. So poor Roland Ratzenberger's accident, which was pretty clearly a front wing failure, was brushed under the carpet, and yet Ayrton's accident was turned into this whole media casino with the prosecuting magistrate at the centre of it. So it was all done for the wrong reasons. We, of course, built up a defence case, but by the time it finally came to court, then I'd moved on to McLaren, which did cause some difficulties. I had the foresight in my negotiations with Ron and McLaren to put in the contract that they would provide a lawyer and pay for a lawyer for me, so that I could have independent representation compared to Patrick, who was the other person who was under charge. And yes, Patrick and I think, worked together to an extent, but equally there were some difficulties on the night of the course. I think the night before the hearing, then Patrick definitely felt under a lot of pressure. And trying to get the judge to understand reasonably complicated analysis from what we got from the data recorders linked to the videos from Michael's car and the circuit footage. He couldn't get it. Didn't matter how many times we explained it and how many angles we tried to come from. He just didn't seem to be able to understand it.
I guess that must have all been pretty traumatic, actually. You know, trying to put something as complicated as that, as important as that, into layman's terms for a judge to make a ruling on, but also, as you say, all the noise and the chaos, which is so different from the ordered life that you're used to in Formula One, and the processes with which you approach things in life. I mean, how difficult was it to almost compartmentalise that and still continue to race and to be able to move on with your career, because there's so much promise and actually so much success still to come? How were you able to deal with that, the tragedy versus, you know, a working Adrian Newey?
I think the immediate days and weeks afterwards were without doubt the most difficult one. Difficult ones. We decided to only field one car in Monaco the following race. Damon really, I think, showed his mettle at that point. It was only his second proper season in Formula One. So to suddenly be team leader in such tragic circumstances was a big weight on his shoulders. And initially in Monaco, sort of the early practice, it looked like he might buckle a bit, and then he found an inner strength and he carried us through Monaco. We had a slightly lucky win in the following race, Barcelona, when Michael's car hit troubles. And then after that it became a battle through the year. Obviously from the drivers, we went on to win the constructors. From the drivers, he had that tremendous disappointment from Damon when basically Michael took him out. So it was a year in many ways we'd all, I guess, rather forget. As time went on, of course, time is a healer, and so we got over the immediate aftermath, and then slowly the legal case started to build. In a way, for me, it was opportune timing, in as much as left Williams in November '96, but didn't start at McLaren until the 1st of August '97. So I had a period of time, so-called gardening leave, where I was at home, and I put some of my time into kind of building my legal defence for Imola.
Was there ever a part of you that questioned the point of racing after Ayrton's death?
Very much so. I mean, as I mentioned, I never thought about it prior to that happening. And I think if you're in that situation, you don't question your involvement and whether you're prepared to go through that again, because it happens once, it can of course happen again. Then you're a fool. And so, yes, it was, I think both Patrick and I separately went through this internal struggle afterwards of, is this what we want to be doing? Patrick, of course, it was different in a way, because he also had a responsibility with Frank to the workforce. But for me, it was, yes, this has been my life. It's what I've always wanted to do. It's what I've been lucky enough to end up doing. But there's a catch there that I'd never ever thought about, and it was a bit of soul searching to go on there. Obviously, I came to the conclusion that yes, I did, but as a result of that, I think ever since have been much more careful about safety, introduce safety systems into the design of the car, but you still end up in positions where, for instance, on the pit wall, you have to make a call. Take Sebastian's accident when he was spun round at the start of the Brazilian race. And the car was damaged. The conservative thing, of course, is to bring it straight in the pits and check it over to make sure it's safe to continue the race. Had we done that, Sebastian wouldn't have won the championship. So you're always under pressure to make those calls. I think
that is a lot of pressure, isn't it?
Yeah.
When lives are at stake.
Yeah.
Versus, as you say, winning championships. But that's what you did when you went to McLaren. Then I guess maybe it was the chance to sort of draw a line under your time at Williams and go on to have success with Mika Häkkinen in '98 at McLaren. But what was Ron like to work for?
Couldn't have chosen two more different teams to work for. Williams was very much sort of run as Frank and Patrick's hobby shop, so it had grown organically from a small team. It had a nice family feel to it. No cumbersome management structures or operating manuals or any of those things. Everybody just got on with their job. McLaren has kind of run a bit more like I would have imagined Microsoft is, not to have obviously ever worked for Microsoft, but it was kind of strict management codes, very well organised, quite procedural in some ways. And so that brings good points, of course, and also it can be slightly stifling to work for at times as well. My early days at McLaren I really enjoyed. I have to admit, when we moved factory to the new factory, I found that quite oppressive. The old factory was a sort of honest factory, on an industrial unit, on an industrial estate, and it didn't really pretend to be anything it wasn't, whereas this new factory was a big architectural statement, and it just felt sort of almost slightly Stalin-esque. You had to walk in through these white corridors, so you sort of felt a bit disorientated by the time you got to your workplace. The workers, I don't know if it's still the same, but you weren't allowed coffee at your desk, you could only allowed water, and one personal picture on your desk which you had to put away at night. So it was a very controlled environment.
And I gather that you had the audacity to try and decorate your office.
That was at the first one, yes. Yeah, the first one.
What did you do?
Well, Ron, as many people probably know, his favourite colour is grey, which I know is strictly speaking not correct anyway, but everything is shades of grey with Ron. And so everything in the McLaren factory was grey, apart from my office, which was John Barnard's old office. And that was floor-to-ceiling mahogany, dark mahogany, with a black desk, black window frames and a dark brown chair. And when I started at McLaren, because it's 1st of August, that's very late to start on the design of a new car. So I was working sort of crazy hours, regularly midnight every evening. And by the time you get to midnight, it was quite a depressing place to be.
I bet.
So Ron persuaded me to come to the Hungarian race. And so leaving on Thursday morning, I gave a paint chart to the factory manager, said, look, please can you brighten the place up here? Here's a duck egg blue as the paint chart. Can you maybe put a tan carpet in and perhaps light tan chair or something, just brighten it up a bit for me. Which she duly did over the weekend. How he did it in one weekend, I don't know. So I came back in on the Monday, and it was so much more cheerful. And it was quite strange, because then if I looked out of my door, it was kind of like looking at a colour photo out to a black and white photo, because everything outside the door was black and white. Anyway, Ron came in that evening to see how I was getting on, and he stood in the doorway, and it was like, and he sort of did this goldfish impression while going purple, or redder and redder, and exactly purple. And I thought, Christ, he's going to,
brought a bit more colour to the room.
I thought he was going to have a heart attack, to be perfectly honest. And then he finally spun on his heels and walked out. Never mentioned a word.
Really?
But apparently he got home to Lisa, his wife, and went absolutely nuts.
No.
So,
did you have to change it back?
No.
Oh, good. So then on to Red Bull, and arguably the most successful period of your career, and it's still ongoing. But at the time, something of a gamble, because I think, as you referred to them yourself in the book, as a fizzy drink company. I mean, what kind of guarantees or assurances were you given, or didn't that matter? Was it quite nice going in with a clean slate and building a team from the bottom up?
I felt I needed a new challenge, and this was exactly that, to, if you like, try to see if I could complete the unfinished business from Leyton House, be involved with the team from the start, and hope that we could build it up with Christian, obviously, aspiration to win races and maybe even dream of winning championships in the future.
And you certainly did.
Well, I mean, you're right, it was a career gamble, and a lot of people at the time said you must be crazy to walk out of McLaren and go to Red Bull. But I just felt I needed something new. I'd been at Williams and then McLaren for quite some years. I needed something different to get me going.
And what do you believe, well, other than your great self, of course, has been the key to the success of the team? Because, you know, you hit a purple patch, the quadruple, double world champions, which obviously has been emulated by Mercedes now. But, I mean, it was astonishing at the time to see this company really come from nowhere and be kind of seen as the party team, if you like. People sort of saw them as a bit of fun, great marketing, but a bit of a joke when it came to the racetrack. And then, you know, you proved them all wrong.
I think that was important for me to understand when Christian had sort of been after me through the whole of the 2005 season. So it couldn't have been complete coincidence. Every time I happened to be walking through the paddock, he happened to be walking the opposite direction and would stop for a chat. He's obviously a very personable type of guy. So we got to know each other a little bit, and then he came up and said, offered would I like to join. One driver that seems to have always, we end up working together through coincidence, has been David Coulthard. So he's at Williams, he was initially the test driver at Williams, then of course became one of the race drivers, then the same at McLaren. And then David went to Red Bull, so of course I got on the phone to David, and David's very much a person, I trust his judgment, and said, you know, David, can we meet? Is this team for real? And he said, yeah, absolutely, son, this is it. They've got the backing and they want to get the job done. So it is really as much as anything on David's recommendation of sort of vote of confidence, and then going over to Austria and meeting Dietrich Mateschitz, the owner, and it's clear that whilst Red Bull as a company, if you like, do like a bit of fun and they like to play hard, they also, it is the work hard, play hard ethic. So it's been great.
Most drivers will say that at some point in their career they would like to race for Ferrari, or at least finish their career with Ferrari. Why have they never been able to lure you over? Because I'm sure they've tried.
Yeah, it's come close it's come close 3 times actually. Initially in my IndyCar career, where Ferrari decided they wanted to build an IndyCar, which was it was actually to show Bernie that they didn't have to do everything that Bernie wanted, so it was a political move more than anything. So I was offered to join as chief designer on their IndyCar project. Didn't feel it was right, so turned that one down. Then much more seriously, Jean Todt offered for me to join as technical director. Young family at the time, decided that wanted to stay in the UK. That's what he did. And then much more recently, in 2014, with the first year of the hybrid era, then it became evident that the Renault was somewhat behind Mercedes in particular, and to an extent the Ferrari. So, and with no obvious end in sight, Renault didn't seem to be willing to really put the funding in to sort the problem out, which was the depressing and worrying bit. So I kind of was in a bit of a difficult position. I didn't want to walk out on Red Bull because, as I say, it feels like home. Been heavily involved right from the start with Christian in building the team up from the ashes of Jaguar to where it is today. So I didn't want to walk out on that. Equally, I didn't want to kind of be in a position where we were operating with one hand tied behind our back on the engine department. So it's a very difficult decision. Ferrari came up with an incredible offer, very attractive, and it caused me a lot of sleepless nights deciding what to do and which to go for. But in the end, I said it would have felt wrong to walk out on Red Bull.
And how involved are you now? Because you don't go to many races, but you're very much still behind the scenes. Do you feel that that hand has been loosened from behind your back? Do you feel that you can make a difference now with the chassis, with the engine that you've got in it, that produce a car 2018 and going forward for the likes of Daniel and Max to win a World Championship?
I am involved less than I was, for sure. So one of the things that came out of that discussion we just said, where I kind of had a decision make in 14 of what to do next, was that I would step back and get involved in other things.
With Aston Martin specifically?
Yes, initially various things we looked at. One of them was the America's Cup with Van Ainsey team.
Oh yeah, of
but
course.
that never really came to proper fruition, unfortunately. And then the road car project became the next thing, which we kind of kicked off as an internal project initially, and then sought a partner, and Aston Martin was the perfect partner for that. So that's involved roughly half my time over the last few years, up until about sort of March of this year, where I did get involved through this last summer properly with the team, or the spring and summer, with the F1 team again to try to get the car performing as well as we could. It's a difficult one because the truth is that the current regulations are mainly about the power unit, and so the chassis, of course, is all vitally important still, but it's a power unit regulation, and I think that is a strategic mistake. Formula One's is its best when there is different power units around, but you can still win even if you haven't got the best power unit.
So what does that mean for Red Bull fans all over the world, that they can't expect a championship anytime soon?
It means we'll keep trying. So we are doing our very best to come up with a competitive car for next year. But it's not all in our own hands is the only kind of way I can put it.
Do you feel that Renault have upped their game in that respect?
Renault they've made good level of progress. So they are certainly, compared to where we were a couple of years ago, then they have closed the gap. And it's now really about where does that go from here? Can they continue to close the gap? In which case, hopefully, if we can then do our bit, we can have a proper championship battle. Or will Mercedes and Ferrari always stay that tantalising amount away from us?
And do you feel confident that you will get the best options? Because obviously they've got a works team on the grid now as well. You know, you would assume that the best engines, the best options would always go to them before you.
We are starting to suffer a little bit on the installation. The hybrid engines are quite complicated installations compared to the old V8s. And so the architecture of the engine in terms of where the oil tank is, where the turbo is, in terms of its clocking, the length, the shape of the exhaust system, everything is now being dictated by the works team, by Enstone, rather than by us, which is not perfect. It slightly compromises the installation compared to what we would like. I think where Renault have always been very good is they are fair in their treatment of customer teams. So I don't feel as if Renault works team will get better engines than we do, and that's one of the reasons why we went to Renault in the first place during the V8 era. So I'm happy on that side. I think the big question really though is can Renault manage to close the gap, because these hybrid power units are very expensive. They're now on a finite lifespan. They'll be all scrap at the end of 2020. So 3 seasons away. Whatever goes in now is rubbish.
Who's the most complete driver that you've worked with?
I think Ayrton obviously has to be a candidate, but unfortunately I can't name Ayrton because our relationship was cut so short, only 4 races. Bobby Rahal was the first driver I developed a really close relationship with in IndyCars. So I will always have a very soft spot for Bobby. Super guy and a very good driver, very underrated driver. In Formula One, I think the drivers that stand out, of course, Nigel for being Nigel, very much a Marmite character, but I always got on very well with him. And good thing about Nigel was he, you know, when he had the odd off day, but when he was on it, he was on it, and you knew he was on it. Just you only had to watch the circuit footage. You could see the way the car was dancing around. So Nigel, I always have a great deal of time for. Damon, of course, you know, Damon's just such a great chap. Again, a bit variable in his performances if I was to be super critical, but drives like his one in Suzuka in '94 were pretty stunning. Mika, such a contrast to any of the other drivers I've worked with, along with Kimi, the two Scandinavians, you know, say almost nothing. Mika knew what he wanted, and if you took the time to sit and listen and translate what he wanted, he was very rewarding to work with. Sebastian and Mark, you know, what a great pairing. Very different in their approach. Mark was super sensitive on the aerodynamics and helped to carry the team through 2008 where we weren't getting the results we hoped for. So I always have a huge amount of time and respect for Mark. Sebastian, clearly delivered 4 championships, so what more can I say?
Is there one driver that you haven't worked with who you always think, oh, I'd quite like to get my hands on him and produce a championship winning car? Would you like to work with Lewis maybe, or Fernando?
I think, yes, I guess the 3 drivers I haven't worked with which would be fascinating to work with would have been Michael, for sure. I mean, obviously a great competitor, supreme competitor. Always felt slightly kind of the enemy, in truth. Shame he let himself down in some of his driving stunts. I think that was just his competitive instinct taking him too far. Fernando, again, came close a few times, another supreme competitor. And, you know, for him to have only won 2 championships all those years ago, who could have forecast that at the end of 2007, that he wouldn't win another one? And still there, still gets it up, doesn't he? And then Lewis, I mean, I think Lewis, you know, his early championships were a bit up and down, but the championship he's just put together this year has, without doubt, in my opinion, been his best one, because he's put together such a strong campaign. There haven't been any weak races. He's known when to battle and when to let a position go rather than take himself out. So he's really driven well this year.
I've got one last question before we wrap things up about your own racing career. Now, I read that you had to have pallet manipulation after a crash, a GT40 crash.
Yeah.
What on earth was that about? Because you do enjoy your racing. I mean, obviously you're known for your brains, but you know, behind the wheel, you know, slouch. And your son races as well, doesn't he?
He does, that's right. Yep.
But what was this about?
I had an accident in my GT40 at Le Mans, which was a big accident. Lost a right rear wheel on the barrier in the braking area quite early on, and had a huge accident at the second chicane on the Muslan. I got out, I thought, unhurt. I just had a cut on my finger and that was it. So, you know, considering what a big accident it was, I thought I was very lucky. But then over the coming days, I started to lose the vision in this eye. So it all sort of started closing down. Everything went a bit grey, and as I say, I couldn't see out of this eye. DC heard about the accident, rang me up and said, "Son, you got to go and see somebody," because he's had whiplash, of course, in his career, and he recognised the signs of whiplash. So I went to see a guy in Henley. He kind of had a look at it, said, "Yep, your skull's out of shape." Stuck his thumb in like that, pulled like hell, which really did hurt. And literally, as soon as he did that, the vision came back, and 24 hours later I felt absolutely fine again. Amazing.
Wow. God, it's quite trusting to let him put his thumb in there and give it a good old tug.
Desperation, I think, yes.
Wow. Never heard that before.
Yeah,
That's amazing. It's been such a pleasure. I knew it would be, but thank you so
Natalie.
much.
No,
Really
great
enjoyed
pleasure.
it.
Thank you for the questions.